The wind howled through the endless stretches of snow, cutting into the cowboy's skin like 1,000 daggers. His breath, visible in the freezing air, puffed out in small clouds, vanishing almost instantly, as if the cold swallowed it whole. Snowflakes whipped across the prairie in a wild, horizontal dance, as if mocking his every move. He had been riding for hours, but the frozen saddle seemed to grow heavier with every mile, the bite of the wind relentless against his coat and scarf. It was late in the afternoon, and the fading daylight offered little hope for warmth. He hadn't planned to be out this long, but when you were on the edge of nowhere, survival meant adapting to the land, not fighting it. He adjusted his worn leather gloves, pulling the reins tighter as his horse crested the next rise, revealing the horizon blurred by a veil of snow. His name was Samuel Sam Wilkins. 34 winters had passed since he first set foot in this land, and not once had the cold treated him with mercy. He had seen every kind of winter imaginable, the dry, biting cold of the plains, the damp chill of the mountains, but none quite like this. Not in a long time. He paused, scanning the horizon. There was nothing but the blanket of snow and the skeletal remains of long-forgotten fences. Somewhere, far in the distance, was his cabin, but it felt a lifetime away. The sun had already begun to dip, and the winds were picking up. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, gnawing at him like a dog after a meal. And then the dread he had long feared seeped in his rifle. The weathered .44 Colt he carried at his side, his most reliable companion, had been running cold for the past few days. The gun had never failed him before, not once. But he knew better than to assume it always would. A rifle jamming in the cold was no small matter. It could be a death sentence. He cursed under his breath, thinking of the stories he had heard of men in these parts, frozen in their tracks by a malfunctioning gun, their lives slipping away before they could even pull the trigger. The cold didn't care about the man or his gun. It was indifferent to the noise of civilization, to the clatter of saloons and trains. It didn't mind the weight of gold or the yearning for comfort. It simply waited, patient and cruel, for the weak to falter, and it had never been more relentless than now. Sam pulled his horse into a sparse grove of trees, using what little shelter they provided. He dismounted, feeling the stiff burn in his legs as he hit the frozen earth. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle strapped to his back, but as he did, the familiar weight of the cold metal sent a chill deeper than the air itself. The frost had begun to claim his bullets, and in this weather that could be the difference between a clean shot and a jammed barrel. It had happened before frosted rounds, frozen into inoperable lumps. He knew what to do, though. This wasn't his first time battling the cold. Sam knelt beside the campfire he quickly set up, the wood crackling under his careful attention. His hands were stiff, but he moved with practiced ease, preparing the small stove that had been part of his gear for years. He carefully set the rounds close to the warmth, the steady heat a lifeline in the unforgiving landscape. As he waited, watching the fire's warmth slowly thaw the metal, his thoughts wandered to an old cowboy he had met years ago. That man had taught him a trick, one that saved his life more than once, warming the bullets before a shot was ever taken. The method had been passed down from men who had fought in colder battles than he could ever imagine. Men who knew that the difference between life and death didn't always come down to skill, it came down to preparation. The fire flickered, and the heat began to work its magic. Sam stared at the growing warmth of the bullets, each one now beginning to soften in the flame's embrace. The trick would buy him enough time to get to safety, to make sure that when the shot needed to be taken, it was true. But even with the heat slowly spreading through the ammunition, the cold was never far behind. Sam sat by the fire, watching the frost melt off the rounds one by one. He knew the trick wouldn't last forever, and the cold had a way of pushing men to their limits. But it was a tool, one more weapon in his belt for surviving the wild. Out here, in the heart of winter, nothing could be taken for granted. The wind howled again, stronger this time, rattling the trees and scraping across the wooden walls of the nearby shelter. Sam had lived through enough winters to understand how unpredictable this land could be. His mind drifted back to a time when he'd first learned that lesson, back to a younger version of himself, when the world seemed simpler but survival had a way of complicating things. It had been years ago, during his first winter out on the range. He'd been green, eager to prove himself, full of piss and vinegar. He'd taken his time building a small cabin, cutting wood, stacking firewood, and dreaming of a life free from the law, free from the shackles of civilization. But the weather didn't care about dreams. The first heavy snowfall hit before he could finish his shelter. By the time he saw the storm coming, it was already too late to make it to town for supplies. He was alone, cold, and nearly out of food. There were a few cans of beans left in his pack, but that was about it. The nights grew longer, the temperatures lower. Sam had never felt more isolated in his life. But the land had a way of teaching you things if you stuck around long enough. He learned how to stretch out every resource, how to hunt for food, even when the snow piled up high. But it was the old cowboy who'd come to visit one night that taught him something more important. Sam had been struggling to keep his rifle warm, firing it only when absolutely necessary. It was a game of survival. Every shot had to count. That's when the cowboy shared his trick. He was a wiry, weather-beaten man with hands like leather, his eyes sharp from years of watching the land. He told Sam the secret of warming his bullets. It seemed too simple at first, but it made all the difference. "You never know when you're going to need it," the old cowboy said, "but when the cold hits, you gotta be ready. You can't waste time in a fight, not when it's this cold." Sam hadn't understood fully then, but now he did. The cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a killer. It didn't wait for you to be prepared. And when it hit hard. The fire crackled beside him as Sam's hands worked the bullets, remembering those lessons. Life had a way of making a man choose his tools carefully, teaching him to survive through stubbornness, wit, and the will to stay one step ahead of the cold. He shifted his position, keeping his eyes on the fire. Survival wasn't just about having the right weapon, it was about having the right mindset. He'd learned that lesson, and it had kept him alive when so many others hadn't made it through the long winters. Sam finished warming the last of the rounds and slid them into his cartridge belt. The fire burned steadily beside him, its warmth a temporary ally against the unforgiving cold. The storm still raged, relentless and unyielding, but he had a job to do. His rifle was ready, his nerves were steady. But even with all his preparations, doubt lingered. It was a feeling Sam had never allowed himself to indulge in. He prided himself on his calm under pressure, his ability to think when the rest of the world panicked. But in the cold of this storm, with night settling in and no sign of relief, a creeping uncertainty gnawed at him. What if the old cowboy's trick wasn't enough? What if this was the winter that broke him? Sam shook his head, clearing the thought. Doubt was a luxury no man could afford, especially when you were alone on the prairie. The world didn't care about a man's fears. It only cared if you were prepared or not. He rose from his crouched position by the fire and gave his horse a pat, checking the reins and the saddle once more. His ride wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ahead lay the ridge, the one he needed to cross to reach the nearest homestead, and beyond that, the town. If he could make it through the night, he'd be safe. But first he had to get past the wolves. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as the wind shifted. There was something out there, something close. A howl sliced through the air, low and haunting. It came again, joined by a chorus of hungry voices. Sam's pulse quickened, his hand moving instinctively to the grip of his rifle. The wolves were circling, testing the air, their senses keen and sharp. Sam knew they'd been watching him for some time. Wolves were smart, and in these parts, they'd become bold. They wouldn't attack unless they were desperate, and desperate was a word Sam understood all too well. He checked his ammunition again, even though he knew the answer. His bullets were warmed. His rifle was solid. It was ready for what lay ahead. Another howl, closer this time, sent his heart into overdrive. They were near. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the prairie seemed to hold its breath before a storm. His instincts kicked in. He didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and crept toward the ridge, where the wolves' silhouettes appeared against the dimming light. The darkness was thickening, but Sam's focus was sharper than ever. He had no choice but to face the pack head-on. The first one came into view, a dark shape, sleek and hungry, its eyes reflecting the dim light of the fire. Sam raised his rifle, his hands steady but his mind working furiously. If he could make the first shot count, the others would scatter. But that his first shot was the moment of truth. The wolf's eyes gleamed in the dying light, its body coiled, ready to pounce. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he raised the rifle, the cold steel of the barrel heavy in his hands. His finger hovered over the trigger, his mind sharp but clouded by the stillness of the moment. There was no room for error. He had to make this shot count. He took a deep breath, holding it, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and echoing in the silence. The wolf jerked back with a yelp, its body crumpling in the snow. For a moment, everything was still eerily, terrifyingly still. Then the rest of the pack emerged from the shadows, their growls low and menacing. The first shot had done its job, but there were more wolves. They weren't giving up so easily. Sam quickly reloaded, his hands moving with practiced speed. He had learned to work swiftly under pressure, to remain calm in the face of danger. But even with his rifle ready and his bullets warmed, something felt off. The shot should have been cleaner. He should have killed the wolf outright, but it had only been wounded. His heart raced, and his eyes darted to the pack's advancing figures. This wasn't like the old days. This wasn't the steady, calculated survival he had known. These wolves were relentless. As they circled him, Sam realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. He was running out of time. He had never been this close to failure before. The trick of warming his bullets, something so simple, yet so vital, had always worked in the past, but in this storm, with the pack closing in and the night growing colder, Sam wasn't so sure. Then, like a whisper from the past, he remembered the old cowboy's voice. It's not just the gun or the trick, it's knowing when to trust it. Sam had learned 1,000 lessons from that man, lessons that had kept him alive when everything else seemed stacked against him. But it wasn't just about warming bullets. It was about trusting his instincts, trusting that everything he'd done up to this point had been preparation for this moment. The first wolf lunged at him, snapping its teeth. Sam fired again. This time the shot was true. The wolf dropped with a heavy thud. The others hesitated, wary of the blast. Sam's heart pounded as he raised his rifle again. He had no choice but to fight. The pack was closing in fast, and they were hungry. But he remembered the trick. It wasn't just about keeping his rifle clean and his bullets warm. It was about using what he had, using his knowledge and his patience. He steadied himself. One shot, one chance. He fired. The wolf fell. The others scattered, retreating into the storm. Sam stood, breathing heavily, his rifle still at his side. The trick had worked, but it wasn't just the warming of the bullets that had saved him. It was the wisdom passed down, the knowledge that survival meant more than just making. The shot it meant trusting yourself. The wolves were gone, their howls swallowed by the storm. Sam stood in the thick silence, the only sound now the crackle of his dying fire. His breath, heavy and labored, swirled in the cold air. The rifle still rested in his hands, but his fingers had gone numb from the biting chill. He lowered it, his eyes scanning the prairie once more, watching for movement, but there was nothing. The night had returned to its relentless cold, and Sam could feel every inch of it. He turned back toward the fire, its warmth now barely a comfort. He could already feel the frost creeping into his bones, the exhaustion from the battle with the wolves settling in. There was no time to rest. He couldn't afford to slow down. His journey was far from over. His cabin was still miles away, and the storm hadn't shown any sign of relenting. But in that moment, as he sat beside the fire and listened to the wind howl around him, Sam allowed himself a brief breath of relief. The trick had worked. The bullets had warmed. The rifle had fired true. And more importantly, he had survived. It wasn't about victory. It was about living through another day. That was the frontier way, never about grand triumphs, but about scraping by, living to fight another fight. It was a lesson learned from every cowboy, every settler who had ever walked the earth in these wild lands. They didn't need to be heroes. They only needed to survive. The fire flickered low, and Sam fed it a few more logs, watching as the embers crackled. His mind wandered back to the old cowboy again, the one who had first taught him that trick with the bullets. Sam hadn't realized it then, but he'd learned more than just a method of survival. He'd learned about patience, about making decisions before the storm hit, about trusting in things that others called foolish. Sam wasn't foolish. He wasn't lucky either. He was just a man who understood that survival didn't always come from skill or brute strength. Sometimes it came from preparation, preparing for the worst, trusting in old ways, and never underestimating the land that could kill you without a second thought. He finished off his last swig of water and stood, gathering his things, pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. His horse was still waiting for him, steady and true, just like his rifle. The night was far from over, but Sam felt a quiet confidence in the way he moved now, the kind of confidence only the frontier could give. He didn't know what lay ahead. There could be more wolves, more cold, more battles with nature. But that was the price of living out here, of living this life. Sam stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and his heart, though cold, was steady. The cold didn't own him. Not tonight.